You ever feel like you're just drowning in headlines about conflicts all over the globe?
Oh, absolutely.
It's easy to feel, I don't know, overwhelmed. How do you even start to make sense of it all? What's really driving this stuff?
Yeah, that feeling is completely understandable. It's a lot. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the actual concepts of war and peace.
Okay,
We'll draw on some pretty solid academic research, hopefully giving you a clearer way to think about conflict in the world today.
right. We've got this document, PSD 2.pdf. It takes a really thorough look from an international relations angle.
hmm
It digs into definitions, history, how these ideas have sort of changed over time.
And our goal, really, for you listening, is to give you a framework, a way to understand what's happening without getting totally lost in, information overload.
Yeah, cut through the noise a bit.
Exactly. Extract the key insights, offer maybe a fresh perspective. You might even find a few surprising things in here.
Okay, sounds good. So where do we start? Maybe with the basic terms?
Definitely. We need to nail down some key terms first. Even words we use all the time have quite specific meanings in this field.
Right.
The document makes a really clear distinction between controversy, conflict, and war.
Okay, controversy, conflict, war. How are they different?
So a controversy is basically a difference of interests between states. Often it's got a legal flavor.
Like a border dispute.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or trade disagreements, things that might end up at the UN Security Council. Interestingly, the UN even distinguishes between a situation, just an objective fact, and a controversy that actually needs them to step in.
Ah, what's
And these are usually handled through political means, which aren't binding, or juridical ones, like court rulings, which are.
Got it. So controversy is more legal, diplomatic disagreement. Conflict sounds like it steps things up a bit.
It does. A conflict is defined as an expressed incompatibility of expectations. It involves hostile attitudes, maybe actions causing actual damage.
So more intense feelings, actual harm potentially.
Right. And a key thing is a conflict can be latent, sort of simmering under the surface, or it can become manifest, erupt into violence.
And more actors involved than just states sometimes.
Often, yes. It usually involves more players than a simple controversy.
Okay, so simmering tensions, maybe violence breaks out, more people involved. That's conflict. Then we get to war. What's the specific definition there?
For that, the document points to SIPRI, that's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They're a big authority on this.
Okay, cyber eye. What do they say?
They define war as an armed conflict involving the military forces of two or more governments, or between a government and an organized armed opposition.
Right.
And this is the key part, resulting in at least 1,000 combat-related deaths within a calendar year.
1,000 deaths. That's a specific threshold.
It's a crucial benchmark, yeah. It often dictates how the international community formally categorizes the violence, which can affect things like intervention, recognition, aid.
That sets a very clear line. Now, the document also says something interesting about armed conflict and peace processes. Aiming for the same thing. How does that work?
It's a fascinating point. Both are ultimately about resolving these fundamental incompatibilities, these clashing expectations or interests.
But obviously using very different methods.
Exactly. That's the critical difference. Violence versus negotiation, diplomacy. A peace process is essentially a structured attempt to find a compromise, to address the root causes driving the conflict through nonviolent means.
And it's not just one meeting, right? It's a whole process.
Absolutely. The document breaks it down. Pre-negotiation first, laying the groundwork, making contacts.
Right.
Then the actual negotiation phase, trying to hammer out the details. Then, hopefully, reaching a formal agreement.
And then making it stick.
That's the final, often trickiest part.
Yeah.
Effective implementation. That involves everything from, say, security arrangements to political reforms, rebuilding trust.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Okay, got the basic terms down. Controversy, conflict, war, peace process. Now let's dig into some of the big thinkers. Clausewitz comes up constantly.
Karl von Clausewitz, yeah. You can't really discuss war seriously without mentioning him.
Prussian military theorist.
That's right. Lived through the Napoleonic Wars, huge impact. His main work on war is still incredibly influential.
And his most famous line is,
War is a continuation of politics by other means.
okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
So war isn't just madness. It's a tool.
That's precisely his point. He saw it as an act of violence, sure, intended to compel your enemy to do what you want,
Right.
but always within a political context. It serves a political purpose.
Hmm.
This leads to his idea of limited war. He argued that while war's nature might push towards total destruction, the political and social reality almost always puts limits on it.
So even if a country could theoretically annihilate its enemy, politics usually stops that.
Exactly. The document gives examples. The U.S. in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan, Israel and its neighbors. In those cases, the capacity for much greater destruction existed.
Sure.
But political goals, available resources, the actual intentions of the leaders, all these things kept the conflict limited, relatively speaking. The means are violent, but the ends remain political.
So war is just one phase in a larger political game. Like tensions rise, accusations, sanctions,
Threats.
then maybe armed conflict breaks out.
And then eventually you return to some kind of political relationship, though probably a changed one. For Clausewitz, war only really makes sense if it has that clear political objective driving it. Otherwise, it's just pointless violence.
That's a powerful lens, but it's not the only way to look at why wars start, is it? The document mentions John Keegan, too.
Right, John Keegan. He approached it a bit differently. He was less focused on the pure political calculus and more interested in the mechanisms that actually trigger wars.
What did he think triggers them?
He started from the premise that war is, to some degree, rooted in human nature itself.
The are we inherently violent question.
Sort of. Keegan, looking back at the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, pointed to enduring motivations like, well, honor, fear, and self-interest.
Honor, fear, interest. Thucydides' big three.
Exactly. Keegan looked at conflicts across history: Sparta versus Athens, Rome versus Carthage, World War I, World War II, even the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
and argued these fundamental human drives are always there, bubbling under the surface, shaping decisions even when leaders think they're being purely rational or political.
So maybe less about grand strategy, more about these gut feelings.
It's a different emphasis, yeah. A focus on the human element, the cultural aspects of why groups fight.
Interesting contrast. The document also mentions a more Eurocentric view, Jeffrey Parker.
Yes, Jeffrey Parker and others did this huge analysis looking at wars way back to 3000 BC, but their focus was predominantly on Western conflicts. They studied figures like Julius Caesar, Clausewitz, of course, but also brought in non-Western thinkers like Sun Tzu and his Art of War. It's a massive historical sweep, trying to find patterns mainly within that Western tradition.
And what about this idea of an East-West conflict dynamic? Anthony Pagden.
Pagden talks about that long history of perceived antagonism between, the Occident and the Orient, going right back to the ancient Greeks like Herodotus.
A really old idea then.
Very old. But Pagden also points out that large-scale direct wars between West and East are actually, historically speaking, more recent. He highlights things like the Opium Wars in the 19th century as key examples of that direct clash.
Okay, so we've got philosophical views, historical patterns.
Yeah.
But then there's a more scientific approach to studying war.
Yes, starting around the 1960s, scholars like J. David Singer and Melvin Small really pushed for a more systematic, quantitative study.
Trying to measure war.
In a way, yes. Singer, especially, wanted to define war clearly and measurably so it could be studied scientifically. He and Small did massive studies of interstate wars, particularly after Napoleon from 1816 onwards. Their book, The Wages of War from '72, was a landmark.
So moving beyond just describing wars to finding, statistical trends.
Exactly. Building on earlier work that focused on what they call negative peace.
Negative peace.
Simply the absence of war, the absence of direct violence. Singer and Small's work helped build data sets and spurred theories, like the democratic peace theory we can talk about later.
And this scientific study wasn't just one thing.
No, the document mentions several angles. Statistical analysis, general theories about causes, looking at different types of conflict, even studying war as a cultural thing, polemology.
Polemology.
Yeah, it focuses more on the societal factors leading to conflict rather than just the fighting itself. It asks why societies go to war.
Interesting. And the reasons for war have changed too, not just wars for loot anymore.
Well, the document contrasts those older wars, often focused on grabbing land or serfs, with modern conflicts where wealth is more tied to technology, industry, trade.
But resources still matter, right? Oil, minerals, water.
Oh, absolutely. Resource competition is still a huge driver, whether it leads to open fighting or just simmering tension. And this scientific approach isn't just political science. It pulls from psychology, sociology, economics. It's really interdisciplinary because war itself is so multifaceted.
It really shows how tangled the roots of war are. Okay, shifting to modern conflict dynamics.
Yeah.
What defines warfare today?
One huge factor is just how multidimensional the causes are. It's rarely just one thing anymore.
Yeah.
You've got political, military, socioeconomic issues, ethnic tensions, religious factors, plus outside interference. It all gets mixed together.
Making them incredibly difficult to solve.
Extremely. The document points to some really brutal examples from the 90s and 2000s, particularly in Central Africa.
Rwanda, the Congo Wars.
Exactly. The Rwandan genocide, the two Congo wars, which some tragically called the African World War, killing millions. These just horrifically demonstrated the complexity and the devastating human cost.
So you need a more holistic way to study them.
Definitely. You need to look at the whole picture. The underlying structure, political, economic, social security aspects.
Okay.
Then the actors involved, who are they? What are their interests, their relationships, their capabilities, their real agendas? Not just the fighters, but peace builders too.
Right.
And finally, the dynamics, the trends, how the conflict is being managed or not, the risks of it getting worse, potential future paths.
And a big part of modern conflict is the rise of non-state actors, isn't it?
That's crucial. We see way more asymmetric conflicts now. State armies versus, well, that's where the definitions get tricky.
Insurgents, freedom fighters, terrorists. The labels matter hugely.
They really do. The document notes how even the U.S. military might use insurgent neutrally, but in Europe it can sound negative, blurring lines between, say, legitimate resistance and terrorism. One person's freedom fighter is another's terrorist, right?
Yeah.
It's very subjective.
Yeah. And that leads to different ways of responding. Counterterrorism versus anti-terrorism.
Exactly. Counterterrorism is more proactive, trying to prevent terrorism from starting or growing. It can involve offensive actions.
Okay.
Anti-terrorism is more reactive, defensive, trying to minimize the damage from existing terrorism, better intelligence, security measures, responding after an attack.
Prevention versus response. And the idea of resistance, how does that fit in?
The term resistance itself carries a lot of weight, often legitimizing actors. Think of the French resistance in WWII. It has this inherent positive connotation that can rally support, even among people who might otherwise be critical of armed struggle.
Right, it frames the conflict differently. Okay, let's shift gears again. Technology's impact. The Industrial Revolution's changed everything.
Profoundly, irreversibly, especially in terms of lethality. The document mentions the Anglo-Boer War as an early warning sign.
Machine guns, armored trains.
Concentration camps, grimly. But World War I was where industrialized killing really took horrifying shape.
Aviation, submarines, tanks, poison gas.
Just devastating innovations. Over 20 million deaths in WWI alone, and then WWII scaled it up even further, maybe 48 million lives lost. Unbelievable destruction.
It's staggering. And this also meant bigger armies.
Much bigger. Before industrialization, armies were often smaller, limited by logistics, funding, but mass production, national conscription, railways, telegraphs,
Right.
all enabled states, starting around the French Revolution, accelerating with industry, to mobilize huge numbers of people and sustain long, large-scale wars.
Leading to total war.
Exactly. By the 19th century, the idea took hold that all resources of a nation, including its civilian population and economy, were part of the war effort and potentially legitimate targets.
The scale is hard to grasp.
Yeah.
France mobilizing 4 million, Germany 5 million at the start of WWI.
The entire society gets drawn in.
So after the horror of WWI, there was a big push to, what? Outlaw war.
There was a huge debate, definitely. A real sense of never again. Figures like U.S. President Woodrow Wilson championed the idea, especially among democratic countries. International relations really emerged as a distinct academic field then, trying to understand and prevent war.
But not everyone was on board with banning war.
No. In totalitarian states, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, the intellectual energy often went the other way, towards justifying war, seeing it as a legitimate, even necessary tool for the state. Lenin, for instance, studied Clausewitz closely.
So a split in thinking. Liberal democracies seeing war as bad, others seeing it as useful.
A fundamental difference in ideology.
And clearly, WWI didn't end all wars.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The document points out conflicts continued right after the Russian Civil War, wars in Hungary, Poland, and even after WWII, between then and the 1990s, there were something like 140 significant conflicts globally,
Wow.
resulting in maybe another 20 million deaths.
And many of those weren't wars between countries.
Increasingly, no, especially outside Europe. While Europe had the Cold War standoff but relative internal peace, Many newly independent nations, particularly in the global south, faced massive internal instability.
Legacies of colonialism, internal divisions.
Exactly. Weak institutions, corruption, ethnic strife, plus Cold War powers meddling, funding proxy wars. It created a very volatile situation in many regions.
And these internal conflicts look different from traditional wars.
Often, yes. More violence against civilians, lots of non-state armed groups, murky funding through crime or resources. Very messy, very hard to resolve with old diplomatic tools. And then later, you get hybrid conflicts.
Right, like Ukraine starting in 2014.
A prime example, mixing conventional fighting with propaganda, cyber attacks, economic pressure, terrorism, blurring the lines.
So this brings us squarely into the Cold War. How did that shape thinking about peace?
Well, for a long time, especially in official circles, peace was just defined by what it wasn't. It was negative peace, simply the absence of a hot war between the U.S. and USSR.
Understandable given the nuclear threat.
Totally. The devastation of the world wars, plus the fear of annihilation, really focused minds on just avoiding that direct clash. But others pushed back, saying that's not enough.
Which led to positive peace. Johan Galtung.
Exactly. Galtung, who founded the Peace Research Institute in Oslo in '59, was a key figure arguing for a much broader concept. And internationally, you had the UN.
The UN was just to prevent war, right?
That was the goal in the charter. Condemn war, provide mechanisms to avoid it. But its record is mixed, shall we say.
Critics point to all the wars that happened anyway.
They do. China, Tibet, USSR, Hungary, Vietnam, countless others. But proponents say, well, the UN still provided a forum, peacekeeping efforts, international law.
And it did authorize force sometimes.
Yes, the Security Council did authorize interventions. The Second Gulf War in '91, Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan after 9/11.
But other interventions were more controversial.
Definitely. NATO in Kosovo in '99, the Iraq War in 2003, those lacked clear, explicit UN Security Council backing and remain highly debated from an international law perspective.
Okay, back to Galtung. His positive peace was much more than just no fighting.
Much more. For him, real peace needed equality of opportunity, eliminating social injustice, ending political oppression, stopping cultural discrimination.
Wow, that's a high bar.
It is. He talked about structural violence.
Structural violence.
Violence that isn't direct, like punching someone,
Yeah.
but is built into the system, the structures of society. Think about systems that lead to huge differences in life expectancy or access to food based on race or class. That inequality, that harm caused by the system is structural violence.
So injustices that kill or harm people indirectly.
Precisely. And he argued you can't have true peace while that exists.
And he wasn't convinced by nuclear deterrence.
Not at all. He argued it didn't actually prevent war, just maybe direct superpower war. Look at all the proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola.
Right. Millions died in those.
Exactly. So deterrence was, for him, a very fragile, unstable, negative peace that ignored the root causes.
The document also mentions Gandhi's philosophy.
A very different but equally profound perspective. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.
Meaning the methods you use have to be peaceful too.
That's the core of it. Coming from the context of India's non-violent struggle for independence, it's about embodying peace in the process of striving for it. The hugely influential idea globally.
Now, during the Cold War, the ideological fight affected everything, even views of the UN.
Oh, completely. The Soviet bloc often saw the UN, influenced by Marxist thought, as basically an arena reflecting global power struggles, class conflict on an international scale.
Dominated by the West initially.
Largely, yes, especially early on. But the Soviets engaged strategically, particularly as more developing countries joined in the '60s, the Third World. They saw an opportunity to build alliances there against perceived Western dominance.
And this ties back to Galtung's dual concept, negative versus positive peace.
Yes, that distinction became really important. Negative peace, just stopping the fighting. Positive peace, building justice, cooperation, tackling those structural issues like inequality and oppression. The Soviets, meanwhile, heavily promoted their own initiative, the World Peace Council.
Which had its own agenda, presumably.
It presented a specific vision of peace, often aligned with Soviet foreign policy goals, which differed quite a bit from Western pacifist movements that usually emphasized individual human rights and democracy more.
So Western pacifism focused more on rights and democracy.
Often, yes, that was a key difference. This contrasted sharply with the Soviet doctrine of limited sovereignty, which basically justified interfering in their satellite states, like Czechoslovakia in '68, to keep them in line.
A big gap there. But were there attempts to bridge this divide?
There were grassroots movements like European Nuclear Disarmament, ENND, tried to find common ground, bringing people from East and West together over the shared threat of nuclear war.
And this track two diplomacy idea.
That's crucial. Track 2 is informal dialogue, citizen to citizen, outside official government channels. The Helsinki Final Act in 1975 was interesting because it actually created space for this.
Oh, so.
It included commitments on human rights and cooperation in culture, science, even family reunification. Civil society groups used these openings for what you could call détente from below.
Building connections despite the government.
Exactly. Communication, cultural exchange, scientist collaborations. These Track 2 efforts, alongside the official Track 1 diplomacy, are seen as really important in slowly thawing the Cold War. And groups like the Assembly of Citizens of Helsinki tried to keep that spirit going even after the Berlin Wall fell.
And the Helsinki Accords had those core principles, the Decalogue.
Yes, 10 foundational principles states agreed on. Sovereign equality, not using force, inviolability of borders, peaceful dispute settlement, non-intervention, human rights.
A kind of rule book for coexistence.
Equal rights and self-determination, cooperation, and fulfilling international obligations in good faith. A really important framework, even if imperfectly followed.
Then, as the Cold War ended, this democratic peace theory gained steam. Michael Doyle.
Right, Michael Doyle formalized it in the 80s. The core idea is pretty striking. Liberal democracies, states with separation of powers, elections, civil liberties, tend not to go to war with each other.
Not with each other. They might fight non-democracies.
Oh, yes, they definitely still go to war. But the historical record shows an almost complete absence of wars between established liberal democracies.
Why? What's the theory?
Doyle pointed to shared democratic norms, transparency making surprise attacks harder, public accountability, and maybe economic interdependence through free markets, which he saw as important too.
Interesting. So, moving past the Cold War, how do we analyze conflicts now? NGOs play a bigger role.
A huge role. Organizations like International Alert, mentioned in the document, use approaches directly from peace research. They systematically analyze conflict.
Wow.
They look at the type of conflict, the causes, the actors involved, the dynamics, very much like that holistic approach we discussed earlier.
Trying to learn from the past to inform the present.
Exactly. They develop scenarios based on past experiences to identify potential intervention points or peace-building opportunities. But, as the document wisely notes, every conflict is unique. You can't just apply a template. It's an evolving field, especially with so many internal conflicts now.
And alongside analysis, there's this push for a culture of peace.
Yes, that gained a lot of momentum post-Cold War. With all the internal fighting, it became clear just stopping big interstate wars wasn't enough.
So what does a culture of peace involve?
It's about proactively building peace at all levels, individual, community, national, global, promoting dialogue, finding common ground, using mediation.
UNESCO was big on this.
Very. They launched a specific Culture of Peace program. The UN even declared a decade for a culture of peace. It emphasizes distinguishing conflict, which is inevitable, from violence.
Okay.
And pursuing positive peace, tackling hunger, inequality, discrimination, the root causes Galtung talked about.
Finally, the document mentions the right to peace. Is that formally recognized?
It's emerging. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights from 1981 was a pioneer, explicitly stating peoples have a right to national and international peace and security.
And peace here means more than just no war.
Yes, it's broader. It includes good governance, human rights, development, the conditions needed for people to live securely and flourish.
Wow. Okay, that's covered a huge amount of ground. From defining war to building peace.
Yeah.
What are the main things listeners should take away?
I think, first, just understanding how conflict has evolved from state versus state to these messy, internal, hybrid, asymmetric conflicts today. It's more complex.
Right.
Second, the importance of peace studies, especially the concepts of positive peace and structural violence. Peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice.
Okay, evolution of conflict, positive peace.
Third, the huge shadow of the Cold War and nuclear deterrence, how it shaped everything. Fourth, the democratic peace theory, that intriguing idea about democracies not fighting each other.
Got it.
And finally, how we analyze conflict, now looking at all the dimensions, actors, dynamics, and the vital importance of actively building a culture of peace, not just reacting to violence.
So for everyone listening, hopefully this deep dive helps make sense of those overwhelming headlines. It gives you a richer framework, maybe, for understanding the forces at play.
Instead of just feeling swamped, you have some tools to analyze what's going on.
Exactly. And that leads us to a final thought, maybe something for you to chew on.
Hmm.
Given how interconnected everything is, global economics, climate, information, how can we as individuals actually contribute to fostering that positive peace? Not just stopping fights, but building justice and cooperation in our own communities and maybe even beyond.
That's the real question, isn't it? How do we translate these big ideas into meaningful action in our own lives? Something definitely worth reflecting on.